rainy weather with a little sleet and snow too have reminded us we are indeed in November. We are finally having appropriate weather for Thanksgiving this coming week. I hope many of you are planning pleasant get-togethers and feasts with family and or friends, or with or without turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, Brussels sprouts, gravy, apple cranberry, or pumpkin pie. The focus on the pilgrims this time of year can feel a little awkward, especially if you don't live in eastern Massachusetts. The Pilgrims did get a lot of help from the Wampanoag through that first winter in 1620. They did have good relations for a few years with them, but eventually the relationship soured due to European immigration pressures. Thanksgiving as a national holiday was created by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 during the Civil War. He wasn't thinking about the Pilgrims that much. The most important goal was to foster national unity during the Civil War. He wanted to express gratitude for the recent Union victories, especially the Battle of Gettysburg, a key turning point in the war. He wanted to formalize the Thanksgiving celebrations and observances that did have roots in colonial times. He wanted a positive, uplifting holiday that acknowledged the blessing of fruitful fields and healthy skies, and celebrated life even in difficult times. And to, interestingly enough, I just found out, respond to Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of Godly's Lady Book, who had been lobbying hard for such a holiday for the last 15 years. Each week, we offer a land acknowledgement to the Munsee Lenape, who were the indigenous peoples of this island. Rather than focus on what happened to the Pilgrims, I thought this year it would be more relevant to New Yorkers to focus on the early relations between the Munsee Lenape people and the first Europeans who came to these shores and created New Amsterdam. As I didn't know that much about the Lenape, I have to confess, I first thought that maybe I could learn something by going to the New York City Museum. No, that didn't turn out to be true. I learned a little bit, but not very much. The same was true of my trip to the New York State Museum next door. Learned a little bit more, but not too much. The National Museum of the American Indian, down in the south of the island, was a much better source of information. What was really helpful was going to the museum store and looking at their books. And that's where I found a book titled Native New Yorkers by Evan T. Pritchard, first published in 2002. Pritchard is himself a Native American of Mi'kmaq origin, and in his book, he dives deep into the detail of the Lenape culture, language, and history. I hadn't realized how extensive the territory of Lenape was. It covered from the Delaware Peninsula all the way into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, up to the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy west of Albany, and the Abenaki land, which is north of Lake George. Scholars think that there were about 15,000 Lenape in the New York City area, living in about 80 different locations before first contact with the Europeans. Lenape were part of a subgroup of tribes called the that are culturally and linguistically identified as the Algonquin group. The Lenape could be considered the grandfathers of the Algonquin peoples that extend all over the Northeast, but into Canada. Culturally, the Lenape are matrilineal, and they have a status and identity that follow the mother, along with hereditary leadership. The agricultural land was managed by the women. The newlywed couples would live with the bride's family, and the bride's family would also help raise the couple's children. The Lenape were river people. They lived along the major rivers that today are known as the Hudson, the Delaware, and the Susquehanna-Chesapeake River estuary. They were skilled canoe builders and traded up and down the East Coast, as well as inland, following the rivers upstream. And then they port between streams so they could trade as far as the Great Lakes. They were also wampum makers, using the quahog shells that are found all in abundance along the East Coast. While wampum was used for trade by indigenous tribes, it would be wrong to think of it as a kind of currency. A better analogy would be think of their trading in works of art that could be worn and displayed as a status symbol, but also to commemorate agreements and treaties. Another very important thing to know about the Lenape is that they were very spiritually oriented. Material possessions weren't that important to them. Because they constructed their long houses and wigwams in a manner of hours, out of whatever materials were locally available, they didn't carry a lot of possessions from one place to another. The whole landscape around them was their home. They were in intimate spiritual communion with the rocks, plants, trees, animals and birds, sky, soil, and water. Those relationships were what had to be carefully maintained and kept in balance so that the ecosystem flourished. Henry David Thoreau was inspired by their spiritual perspective. It also influenced the American development of transcendentalism, part of our heritage. Rather than sitting in church to hear the word of God, the transcendentalists would go for a walk in the natural world to commune directly with God. The spiritual health of the Lenape was visible in their physical appearance that impressed Verrazano so much in 1524 when they made first contact with the Munsee. Their height suggested their health and balanced diet, their sociable, pleasant demeanor, their intelligence, sensed through their ability to communicate without a common language. Verrazano compares them with the Greek and Roman cultures revered during the European Renaissance period during which they were living. What a tragedy that their health and vitality was destroyed by European infections to which the Lenape had little or no resistance. By the time Henry Hudson showed up in 1609, whole villages had been wiped out, much like what had happened to the Pilgrims that they discovered when they came to Plymouth. Stories of that first meeting with the Dutch, influenced by a premonition that the people had that there would be such a meeting by a wise elder. They report that they put out beaver furs for the Dutch to stand or sit on to show them that they were honored guests. Little did they realize that they What they had done was a little like sprinkling gold dust in front of prospectors. The Dutch realized how valuable those beaver pelts were back in Europe for making hats. Beavers had almost been driven to extinction in Europe, and their skins garnered a high price. Lenape thought of beavers as rodent pests and didn't appreciate their value to their guests, willing to offer trinkets in exchange, like small axes and knives, common to Europeans, but not to the Munsee, who had no metal besides a little copper from the Great Lakes area. When the first ships arrived with settlers who wanted to build homes on the Munsee land is when that famous 60 guilder deal was struck. What the Dutch thought that they were buying was the island of Manhattan for settlement. What likely the Lenape thought was happening was a gift exchange, to make an agreement to live together and share the land, which couldn't be bought anyway. The Lenape were skilled in diplomacy of the gift economy with their neighboring tribes and between tribes within their confederacy. The principle of reciprocity governed the gift-giving process. Goods and services were exchanged through giving gifts with the expectation of receiving something later in return. The purpose was to strengthen relationships and social bonds rather than accumulate personal wealth. One gained status by giving away wealth rather than possessing it. You might imagine this wasn't how the Dutch operated. They assumed the deal was consummated in the transaction itself, and accumulating personal wealth was the purpose of existence. The Dutch didn't understand relationship building as the purpose of the gift, because they were using barter to generate personal wealth independent of the relationship. The goal was to get the best deal, which might cheat the other person. The conflict became clear when the Dutch began building fences around their properties and fields rather than sharing space. That unwillingness to share became clear when they built a wall between them and the Lenape, today called Wall Street, to keep them out of the villages, cutting off ancient trails to the south end of the island. Another dynamic of a gift economy is it undermines greed that stimulates the urge to hoard. For the Dutch, however, greed was the major motivator to participate in trade. And they didn't want to accumulate a lot of IOUs in the trading process for beaver pelts, but rather have discrete transactions. When the Lenape figured out this difference, they had less interest in trading with Europeans because the stuff that they traded was easily satisfying their material needs for knives and axes and trinkets. After all, how many do you need for your personal use? That changed, however, when the Europeans figured out that what the Native Americans did crave was wampum. That became, for the Dutch, currency that could stimulate trade to get them to trap, kill, and skin more and more beavers and other animal skins that the Europeans wanted. With the expansion of European settlement and the encroachment upon European land, to the Lenape land, conflict was inevitable. Pritchard makes clear in his book, the Lenape were a peace-loving people. In their spiritual understanding, taking a life unjustly was a grave offense. Diplomacy was their go-to way to resolve conflict. Sadly, the Dutch corrupt leaders, then the English ones at the time, generated one offense after another that led to a horrible, unnecessary war in the 1640s. And by the 1700s, that brought the expulsion of native peoples to the West. Although now the Lenape as a nation have been officially removed to reservations in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Canada, they are still here and are advocating for greater awareness and engagement with their traditional land called Lenape-Hoking. They are striving to become more visible here in Manhattan by actively promoting their culture and history, and through initiatives like the Lenape Center, which focuses on art, education, and community engagement. They highlight their ancestral connection to the land through land acknowledgments, like we're doing, public events, and collaborations with cultural institutions, all the while advocating for recognition of their ongoing presence in the city as the original inhabitants of Mannahatta, which translated means island of trees and hills. Right now, they're participating in an exhibition over at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum on the theme of home. And you can find them on Instagram too. There's a lot of documentation of the different things they're doing. So those of you who plan to celebrate Thanksgiving this year in one form or another, I hope that you can pause to also offer thanks to the generosity of the Munsee Lenape people who welcomed the Dutch settlers and offered to share Lenape-Hoking with them. May we continue to remember their gift we benefit from today and seek opportunities to return that gift, that IOU, and support their effort to remain here and be remembered. Especially may we remember the non-materialistic spiritual approach to the ecosystem that flourished under their stewardship. May we learn from them as we seek to move away from exploiting our planet and move toward living in harmony with it. So be it.